Hi guys. Tonight, we're going back to a time when being alive was already a small victory. Not because people were reckless, but almost everything around them was quietly trying to end them. In the Middle Ages, survival wasn't dramatic, it was accidental. Food could poison you, medicine could finish the job, and most dangers looked so normal that nobody thought to avoid them. Tonight, we're exploring the bizarre ways medieval people nearly went extinct, not through one great disaster, but through everyday life itself. A world where survival was never guaranteed. Tonight, we step into a world where survival was never guaranteed, not by birth, not by strength, and certainly not by hope. The Middle Ages were not defined by constant screaming chaos or endless battlefields, but by something far quieter and more unsettling, the steady presence of risk in everyday life. For medieval people, danger did not announce itself loudly. It lived in bread, in water, in weather, in routine. Survival was not an expectation, it was a temporary condition. To be born in the medieval world was not to be welcomed into safety, but into uncertainty. Infant mortality was so common that many parents delayed emotional attachment, knowing that naming a child too early could invite grief. A life could end before it truly began, not through violence, but through fever, infection, or a winter that arrived a little earlier than expected. Death was not dramatic, it was familiar. It sat quietly in homes, fields, and churches, shaping how people thought about tomorrow, if they thought about it at all. Medieval society lacked the modern illusion of control. There were no guarantees written into systems, no institutions designed to protect the individual from failure. When crops failed, hunger followed. When sickness spread, it spread unchecked. When a fire began, it consumed entire streets before anyone understood how to stop it. Survival depended less on planning and more on fortune, tradition, and the fragile balance between humans and their environment. Most people lived close to the land, and the land was unpredictable. A single bad harvest could ripple outward, turning abundance into famine within months. Grain stores were limited, preservation methods were crude, and transportation was slow. A village could starve not because food did not exist somewhere else, but because it could not reach them in time. Survival often hinged on geography as much as effort. Time itself moved differently in this world. Without clocks governing daily life, people lived by daylight, seasons, and habit. This slower rhythm did not mean life was peaceful. It meant danger had more time to take root. Illness could worsen unnoticed. Injuries could become fatal infections. Hunger crept rather than struck. Survival was a long negotiation rather than a single battle. Medical understanding offered little reassurance. The body was a mystery interpreted through ancient texts, superstition, and religious belief. Pain was often seen as a moral or spiritual test, rather than a symptom to be treated. A simple wound could end a life, not because it was severe, but because no one knew how to prevent it from turning deadly. Survival depended as much as avoidance as endurance. Housing provided shelter, but rarely security. Homes were built quickly, cheaply, and close together. They kept out some of the cold, but invited fire, disease, and collapse. Smoke filled rooms. Animals shared living spaces. Clean water was never guaranteed. The very places meant to protect life quietly shortened it. Weather ruled without negotiation. A cold summer could mean famine. Heavy rain could destroy roads and isolate communities. A harsh winter could freeze livestock, rot stored food, and weaken bodies already living on the edge. People did not speak of climate trends or long-term patterns. They experienced weather as fate. Survival was seasonal, reset every year by forces beyond human influence. Faith offered meaning, but not protection. Prayer explained suffering, but it did not prevent it. Religious rituals marked life stages that were often cut short. Burial grounds filled steadily, quietly reinforcing the understanding that life was temporary and fragile. Survival was seen as something granted, not earned. What makes this world difficult to fully grasp today is not its violence, but its normality. Medieval people did not live in constant panic. They worked, celebrated, married, and raised children. But beneath these ordinary acts was an unspoken awareness that life could unravel without warning. Survival was assumed only for today, never promised for tomorrow. There were no universal standards of safety, no inspections, no protective equipment, no expectation that life should be long. Risk was embedded into existence so deeply that it became invisible. People adapted not by eliminating danger, but by living alongside it. This fragile balance shaped human behavior in subtle ways. People trusted tradition over innovation because change carried unknown risks. They stayed close to home because travel invited exposure. They accepted suffering because resisting it rarely changed the outcome. Survival depended as much on conformity as on courage. Entire generations lived without knowing whether their world would endure, and yet they woke each morning and continued, not because they believed survival was assured, but because there was no alternative. This was the medieval condition, a world where life persisted without guarantees, where extinction was not a dramatic event, but a quiet possibility always lingering at the edge of daily routine. And it is from this fragile beginning that the deeper dangers of medieval life quietly emerge. Living close to the edge without knowing it. Medieval people did not believe they were living dangerously. That is perhaps the most unsettling truth about their world. Risk was not something they actively measured or discussed. It did not feel extreme because it was ordinary. The edge of survival was not marked by warning signs or dramatic moments. It was quietly woven into daily habits that felt normal, inherited, and unquestioned. Each morning began much the same way. People rose with the light, ate what little food they had preserved, and returned to work they had done since childhood. There was no sense that these routines were dangerous, and yet nearly every action carried consequences that could slowly, invisibly shorten a life. Food, for example, was rarely fresh in the way we understand it today. Bread was baked from grain that might have been stored for months, sometimes years, in damp conditions. Mold was common, but not always visible. People learned to scrape it away, to ignore strange tastes, to trust hunger more than caution. What sustained them one day could weaken them the next. They did not know they were consuming toxins, only that food was scarce and wasting it was unthinkable. Water was another quiet risk. Streams, wells, and rivers served entire communities, shared with animals, waste, and runoff from nearby fields. The water often looked clear. That was enough. No one understood bacteria or contamination. Illness that followed was blamed on weather, spirits, or divine will, not on the water itself. Living close to the edge meant never realizing where the edge actually was. Homes, too, felt safe because they were familiar. Built from wood, mud, and straw, they offered shelter from wind and rain, but they also trapped smoke, dampness, and disease. Fires burned constantly indoors, filling lungs with soot. Floors were often dirt. Insects thrived in bedding. Animals slept close for warmth. None of this felt dangerous. It felt necessary. People adapted to discomfort without recognizing its cost.
Work followed the same pattern. Farming tools were heavy, crude, and unforgiving. Injuries were common, but rarely treated beyond basic cleaning and prayer. A cut that did not seem serious could become infected. An infection could spread silently. Fever might follow days later. By then, it was often too late. People did not associate cause and effect the way we do now. Living close to danger meant never seeing the chain but led to death. Children grew up absorbing these risks without instruction. They learned by watching, not by warning. They carried water from the same streams, played in the same streets, breathed the same smoke. Accidents were part of growing up. Survival depended less on protection and more on luck. Many did not make it far enough to learn caution. Even rest carried danger. Sleep came on rough bedding, often damp, shared among family members. Illness spread easily in close quarters. Lice, fleas, and other parasites were common, accepted as part of life. Scratching, fever, and weakness were treated as inconveniences rather than warnings. People lived with constant low-level sickness, unaware that it was slowly eroding their strength. Travel, when it happened, felt routine rather than risky. A walk to the neighboring village or a journey to market was familiar. Roads were unpaved, bridges were fragile. Banditry existed, but exposure was the greater threat. Cold, rain, and exhaustion could turn a simple trip into a fatal one. Still, people traveled because they had to. Danger did not announce itself, it accumulated. The edge was also psychological. People lived with a narrow understanding of possibility. If something had always been done a certain way, it was assumed to be safe enough. Questioning tradition was rare, not because people were intelligent, but because experimentation carried risks no one could afford. Trying something new could mean starvation, illness, or social exclusion. Religious belief reinforced this acceptance. Suffering was interpreted as part of a larger order. Illness was not necessarily a failure of practice, but a test, a punishment, or a mystery beyond human control. This worldview offered comfort, but it also dulled alarm. If danger was divinely permitted, then recognizing it changed nothing. Communities reinforced normalization. When everyone around you lived the same way, danger felt shared and therefore invisible. Death was common, but not shocking. People grieved, but they did not panic. Life expectancy was low, yet rarely calculated. Living close to the edge felt like living normally. Seasonal change sharpened this condition. In good years, abundance masked fragility. In bad years, collapse came quickly. A late frost, excessive rain, or dry summer could undo months of labor. Hunger crept in quietly. Rations shrank. Bodies weakened. Disease followed. No single moment marked the transition from stability to crisis. It happened gradually, unnoticed, until survival was already threatened. There were moments when people sensed danger, but they lacked the language to define it. A strange sickness, a pattern of deaths, a year that felt wrong. Without knowledge to connect these signs, concern faded into resignation. Living close to extinction did not feel dramatic. It felt inevitable. What kept medieval people functioning was not confidence, but familiarity. They trusted what they knew, even when it harmed them. Risk was not evaluated, it was inherited. Every generation learned the same habits passed down without understanding the consequences. Survival depended on continuity more than awareness. This closeness to the edge shaped behavior in subtle ways. People conserved energy, avoided unnecessary conflict, and relied heavily on community. These adaptations helped, but they did not eliminate danger, they merely postponed it. Perhaps the most striking aspect of medieval life is how rarely people described their world as unsafe. They spoke of hardship, of God's will, of fate, but not of systems failing them. There were no systems to fail. Life just was. And so medieval people moved through their days unaware of how narrow the margin truly was, how easily one misstep, one spoiled meal, one infected wound could tip life into loss. The edge was always there. They simply lived so close to it that it disappeared from view. And as long as danger remained unseen, it continued to hide in the most essential act of all, eating.
Food that sustained life and sometimes ended it. Food was the foundation of medieval survival, but it was also one of its quietest threats. People understood hunger well. They feared famine, empty storehouses, and long winters with nothing left to grind or boil. What they did not fear, because they did not understand it, was the food they managed to secure. The very meals that kept them alive often carried dangers that worked slowly, invisibly, and without immediate warning. Most medieval diets were simple and repetitive. Bread formed the center of daily nourishment, accompanied by thin soups, grains, and whatever vegetables could be grown locally. Meat was rare for the poor and seasonal even for the wealthy. This simplicity created stability, but it also meant dependence. When a single staple failed or became contaminated, entire communities were exposed. Grain was harvested once a year and expected to last until the next. Storage mattered more than abundance. In damp climates, grain absorbed moisture from the air and ground. Mold thrived in these conditions, especially in dark granaries and wooden bins. People noticed spoilage only when it was visible or tasted bitter. Often it was neither. Mold that produced toxins could hide within otherwise usable grain. The bread baked from it looked normal, it smelled familiar, and it was eaten. No one connected recurring sickness to stored food. Headaches, weakness, hallucinations, and sudden deaths were interpreted through spiritual or moral explanations. In some years, entire regions suffered strange outbreaks of illness tied not to plague, but to what they were eating. Survival depended on calories, not caution. Wasting food was more dangerous than consuming it. Vegetables offered little certainty either. Root crops could rot underground. Leafy plants wilted quickly. Preservation methods were limited to drying, salting, or fermenting, techniques that reduced risk but did not eliminate it. Improperly preserved food spoiled easily. Smell was the primary test. If it did not reek, it was eaten. Meat posed a different challenge. Animals were slaughtered rarely and consumed quickly. Without refrigeration, spoilage began almost immediately. Salting extended shelf life, but salt was expensive and unevenly applied. Parasites were common, though invisible. Undercooked meat carried risks no one understood. Illness that followed was blamed on chance or divine displeasure. Even dairy, a staple in many regions, was unpredictable. Milk spoiled rapidly. Cheese and butter offered longer preservation, but contamination remained possible. Molds were sometimes welcomed, sometimes feared, and rarely understood. The line between nourishment and poison was thin and invisible. Hunger forced compromise. In lean times, people ate food they would otherwise avoid: grain mixed with chaff, bread stretched with unfamiliar plants. Foraging expanded diets in dangerous ways. Berries, roots, and herbs were gathered without consistent knowledge of toxicity. What had fed ancestors safely could still cause harm if misidentified or improperly prepared. Alcohol offered a strange form of safety. Weak beer and ale were often safer than water, as the brewing process killed some contaminants. But alcohol brought its own risks. Overconsumption weakened bodies already malnourished.
dependency was common but rarely acknowledged. Drink sustained life while quietly dulling it. Famine sharpened all these dangers. When food was scarce, standards collapsed. Mold was ignored, rotten portions were cut away, and the rest consumed. Animals that died of illness were sometimes eaten. Survival demanded choices that shortened life in exchange for avoiding immediate death. Food distribution also mattered. Markets brought variety, but also exposure. Goods traveled slowly, spoiled along the way, and passed through many hands. Urban populations depended on supply chains they did not control. When they failed, hunger and disease followed quickly. Even the wealthy were not immune. Rich diets included more meat and imported goods, but also heavier sauces and excess. Overeating, gout, and digestive illness were common. Spoilage affected them too, just differently. Wealth changed the form of risk, not its presence. Rituals surrounded food, enforcing tradition over analysis. Fasting days altered diets suddenly. Feasts encouraged excess. Religious calendars shaped consumption in ways that sometimes weakened bodies rather than strengthening them. Faith guided eating as much as hunger did. Children were especially vulnerable. Weaning foods were often unsuitable. Gruels made from questionable grain, milk that spoiled quickly. Many did not survive the transition from breast to solid food. Their deaths were mourned, but rarely examined. The relationship between food and survival was therefore deeply ironic. Eating was necessary, but never entirely safe. Each meal was an act of trust in storage, preparation, tradition, and luck. People survived not because their food was safe, but because their bodies endured repeated harm until they no longer could. Over time, patterns emerged that no one could explain. Certain years felt sickly, certain regions seemed cursed. Food was rarely blamed because it was too central to question. To doubt it was to doubt survival itself. And so medieval people continued to eat what they had, unaware that nourishment and danger shared the same plate. This quiet threat shaped bodies, weakened immune systems, and prepared the ground for something even more dangerous: medical treatment that misunderstood what illness truly was.
When medicine was guesswork, not science. In the medieval world, medicine was not a system built on evidence, testing, or understanding of the human body. It was a collection of inherited beliefs, rituals, and assumptions passed down across generations without meaningful challenge. Illness was not something to be analyzed, it was something to be explained, and those explanations were rarely grounded in reality. Survival, therefore, depended not on the effectiveness of treatment, but on how much damage a body could endure before collapsing. The foundation of medieval medicine rested on ancient theories, especially the idea of the four humors. According to this belief, the human body was governed by four internal fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Health was balance. Disease was imbalance. This concept shaped nearly every medical decision for centuries. Symptoms were not treated as signals of infection or injury, but as signs that something inside the body had tipped too far in one direction. Because of this, treatment focused on removal rather than support. Weakness did not suggest rest, it suggested excess. Fever did not indicate infection, it indicated too much heat or blood. The response was almost the same: take something away. Bloodletting became the most common and trusted medical practice in medieval Europe. Veins were opened with blades, leeches were applied to the skin, blood was drained from patients already weakened by hunger, disease, or exhaustion.
These procedures were not rare or extreme, they were routine. A person suffering from fever might be bled multiple times over several days. Children, the elderly, and pregnant women were not exempt. When patients fainted or died, it was rarely blamed on the treatment. Death was attributed to the severity of the illness or to divine will. The idea that medicine itself could be harmful was almost unthinkable. Purging was another favored method. Vomiting, diarrhea, and sweating were encouraged as ways to expel illness from the body. Strong laxatives and emetics were prescribed, often made from toxic substances. The suffering they caused was seen as proof that they were working. Pain meant progress. If a patient survived, the treatment was praised. If they died, it was assumed that nothing could have saved them. Medieval remedies often included substances we now recognize as poisons. Mercury was used to treat skin conditions and infections. Arsenic appeared in various compounds. Lead was present in ointments and cosmetics. These substances caused slow, cumulative damage. Symptoms of poisoning were mistaken for disease progression, leading to more aggressive treatment rather than restraint. Surgery existed, but it was a last resort and a terrifying one. There was no understanding of bacteria or antiseptics. Instruments were reused without cleaning. Hands were not washed. Wounds were cauterized with hot irons to stop bleeding, sealing infection inside the body. Amputations were performed quickly, not carefully, because speed reduced suffering, but not mortality. Infection killed many who survived the blade. Anesthesia did not exist in any reliable form. Alcohol and herbal sedatives dulled pain, but also suppressed breathing and weakened patients further. Surgery was an act of desperation, not confidence. Survival afterward depended entirely on luck. Medical practitioners themselves varied widely in skill and authority. University-trained physicians studied texts rather than bodies. They relied on logic, astrology, and classical writings, often without ever touching a patient. Barber surgeons handled wounds, bloodletting, and minor procedures, learning through repetition rather than theory. Folk healers used herbs, charms, and local knowledge, sometimes achieving better results simply because their treatments were less aggressive. There was no unified standard of care. Diagnosis depended on symbolism rather than observation. Urine was examined for color and sediment. Pulse was felt, but poorly understood. Astrological charts determined when treatments should occur. Illness was often linked to planetary movements, personality traits, or moral failure, rather than physical cause. Hospitals existed, but they were not places of healing in the modern sense. They served as shelters for the sick, poor, and dying. Overcrowding was common. Beds were shared. Clean water was scarce. Infection spread easily. Many people entered hospitals seeking relief and left only when carried out. Pain management was minimal. Suffering was expected and even respected. To endure pain without complaint was seen as virtuous. Excessive suffering was interpreted as spiritual trial. Relief was secondary to meaning. The goal of medicine was not comfort, but correction, however brutal. Women faced unique medical dangers. Pregnancy and childbirth were among the leading causes of death. Midwives relied on experience rather than formal training. When complications arose, there were few options. Prolonged labor, hemorrhage, and infection killed countless women quietly, often at home. Medical intervention, when attempted, frequently worsened outcomes. Mental illness was poorly understood and deeply feared. Conditions we would now recognize as depression, anxiety, epilepsy, or psychosis were explained through morality and religion. Treatments included prayer, isolation, restraint, and sometimes exorcism. Compassion existed, but it was limited by misunderstanding. Those who did not conform were often hidden away rather than helped. Medicine also reinforced social hierarchy. The poor received harsher treatments or none at all. The wealthy could afford physicians, but access did not guarantee safety. More treatment often meant more intervention, and therefore more risk. Wealth changed the style of suffering, not its outcome. Failures did not weaken trust in medicine, they strengthened it. Every death confirmed the belief that illness was powerful and mysterious. Rare recoveries were celebrated as proof that treatments worked. There was no mechanism to question authority, no method to test effectiveness, no incentive to change tradition. Occasionally, individuals noticed patterns. Some healers lost fewer patients, some treatments seemed less destructive, but these observations rarely spread. Knowledge moved slowly, authority moved faster. Innovation was dangerous in a world where mistakes could kill. Seeking medical help, therefore, was a gamble. Doing nothing was also a gamble. There was no safe option, only different risks. Survival depended less on choosing correctly and more on whether the body could withstand both illness and intervention. Medicine, meant to preserve life, often weakened it instead. Bodies already compromised by hunger, poor sanitation, and exhaustion were pushed beyond their limits by treatment itself. This left populations more vulnerable, not less. And as medicine struggled blindly in the dark, disease found opportunity, moving faster than understanding, spreading through bodies already made fragile by the very efforts meant to save them. Disease moved faster than knowledge. In the medieval world, disease was never patient. It did not wait for understanding, explanation, or preparation. It moved silently and relentlessly through bodies and communities, while human knowledge remained trapped in tradition and fear. This imbalance between the speed of illness and the slowness of learning defined one of the most dangerous conditions of medieval life. People recognized sickness, but not disease, as a system. A fever was an event, not a signal. A cough was an inconvenience, not a warning. Illness was personal, not collective. This misunderstanding allowed disease to travel freely, unchecked by any coordinated response. By the time communities realized something was wrong, it was already too late. Medieval explanations for disease were shaped by belief rather than observation. Bad air, corrupted winds, divine punishment, and astrological misalignment were common explanations. These ideas offered meaning, but provided no protection. If disease came from the heavens or from moral failure, then there was little reason to examine water, waste, or contact between people. Trade routes became invisible highways for infection. Medieval economies depended on movement, grain, cloth, animals, and people traveling between towns and cities. With them traveled fleas, parasites, and pathogens. Ships docked carrying healthy sailors who fell ill days later. Caravans arrived with goods and left behind sickness. No one connected movement with mortality. Cities magnified the danger. Medieval towns were crowded spaces where people lived close together out of necessity, not choice. Houses were tightly packed, streets were narrow, air circulation was poor. Waste was thrown into open drains or directly onto roads. Animals moved freely among people. In such conditions, disease did not need effort to spread, it simply existed. Once illness entered a city, it moved rapidly. Families shared single rooms, beds were communal, caregivers slept beside the sick, children remained close to dying parents. Love and duty became pathways for infection. Isolation was rare, not because people rejected it, but because survival depended on closeness. Medical responses did little to slow this movement. Physicians treated symptoms without understanding transmission. Bloodletting weakened patients further. Purging dehydrated already fragile bodies. Hospitals gathered the sick together, unintentionally accelerating contagion. Doctors moved from patient to patient without washing hands, carrying disease with them unknowingly. Plagues were not isolated catastrophes, they were recurring features of life. Some outbreaks killed quickly, others lingered for years. Between major plagues were constant waves of smaller illnesses, fevers, coughs, intestinal diseases, skin infections. Medieval life was shaped not by one great epidemic, but continuous exposure to sickness. The Black Death stands out in memory, but it was only one chapter in a longer story of vulnerability. Smallpox scarred survivors and killed children. Dysentery spread through contaminated water. Tuberculosis consumed bodies slowly. Typhus followed war and famine. Each disease exploited the same weaknesses again and again. Religion shaped responses in ways that often worsened conditions. Public prayers gathered crowds. Processions filled streets with bodies moving together in close contact. Flagellant movements traveled from town to town, spreading infection as they sought repentance. Faith gave comfort, but it also created perfect conditions for disease to multiply. Fear filled the space where knowledge failed. Rumors spread faster than understanding. Outsiders were blamed. Minorities were accused of poisoning wells or angering God. Violence followed panic. Communities turned inward instead of addressing practical causes. Disease thrived amid division. Attempts at quarantine were inconsistent and poorly understood. Some cities closed gates too late. Others isolated the sick without providing food or care, forcing families to hide illness rather than report it. Fear of isolation discouraged honesty. Disease remained invisible until it was unavoidable. Time itself worked against learning. Outbreaks rose and fell unpredictably. Survivors interpreted recovery as divine mercy rather than immunity. When disease faded, urgency faded with it. Lessons were not preserved, only endured. Each generation relearned the same pain. Written knowledge existed, but it was locked behind literacy and authority. Medical texts repeated ancient ideas without challenge. Universities preserved tradition instead of testing it. Innovation threatened social order. Questioning established explanations carried spiritual and political risk. Climate made everything worse. Cold weakened bodies. Wet seasons contaminated water. Drought caused hunger, which reduced resistance. Disease followed famine closely. Malnutrition lowered immunity, turning minor infections into fatal ones. Survival became a fragile chain where one failure triggered another. Children suffered most. Childhood diseases killed quietly and in large numbers. Families expected loss. Survivors carried weakened health into adulthood. Population recovery was slow, constantly interrupted by new outbreaks. Life expectancy remained low not because people aged quickly, but because so many never aged at all. Disease reshaped societies after it passed. Labor shortages followed mass death. Wages rose briefly. Social hierarchies shifted. But these changes were reactive, not preventive. When populations recovered, old habits returned. Conditions remained unchanged. Communities adapted psychologically rather than practically. Death became familiar. Mass graves became ordinary. Fear dulled into acceptance. Disease was seen as inevitable, not preventable. This resignation was its greatest ally. The true danger was not ignorance alone, but speed. Disease adapted quickly. Pathogens changed. Human behavior shifted slowly. Each outbreak tested limits faster than understanding could grow. Survival favored those isolated by chance, geography, or resistance, not those protected by knowledge. Bodies became the battleground where this imbalance played out. Immune systems learned slowly, one generation at a time. Disease exploited every weakness immediately. The result was a world where sickness felt permanent, inevitable, and woven into life itself. Because illness seemed constant, prevention felt pointless. Why clean streets if people died anyway? Why change habits if disease always returned? This logic allowed waste to accumulate, water to stagnate, and overcrowding to worsen. And so disease continued to move faster than knowledge, feeding on misunderstanding, tradition, and delay, until sickness became not an emergency, but a background condition of existence. In such a world, cleanliness was not a priority. Survival focused on food and shelter, not hygiene. And where sanitation was rare, illness found endless opportunity.
Sanitation was rare, illness was common. In the medieval world, cleanliness was not ignored out of carelessness, it was absent because it was not understood. Sanitation, as a concept, did not exist in any systematic or preventative form. People lived surrounded by waste, decay, and contamination, not because they chose to, but because they saw no alternative. Illness was so common that it felt natural, an expected part of life rather than a sign that something was wrong. Most medieval towns and villages had no organized waste removal. Human waste, animal dung, food scraps, and industrial byproducts were discarded wherever space allowed. Streets served as dumping grounds. Rain washed filth into open drains, streams, and wells, the same sources used for drinking and cooking. Water did not appear dangerous. It flowed, it looked clear, and it was essential. That was enough. Homes offered little separation from this environment. Floors were often bare earth or rough planks that absorbed moisture and waste. Garbage accumulated nearby. Animals moved freely in and out of living spaces. Chickens, pigs, goats, and dogs shared courtyards and sometimes interiors. Their presence was practical, even comforting, but it also ensured constant exposure to parasites and disease. In cities, the problem intensified. Population density increased without any corresponding improvement in infrastructure. Narrow streets limited airflow. Tall buildings blocked sunlight. Waste piled up faster than it could be dispersed. Latrines overflowed. Cesspits leaked into surrounding soil. Entire neighborhoods sat above slow-moving contamination. Smell was constant. Rotting waste, stagnant water, smoke, and decay blended into the background of daily life. People grew accustomed to it. Odor became a guide to danger, but it was unreliable. If something smelled foul, it was avoided. If it did not, it was assumed safe. Invisible threats went unnoticed. Bathing was rare, not because people rejected cleanliness, but because water access was limited and heating it was labor-intensive. Public bathhouses existed in some regions, but they declined over time due to cost, moral suspicion, and fear of disease, ironically increasing the very problem they sought to avoid. Personal hygiene became secondary to survival tasks. Clothing absorbed filth. Fabrics were washed infrequently, often in the same water used for cooking or drinking. Lice and fleas thrived in seams and bedding. These parasites were not seen as dangerous, only irritating. Scratching was normal. Infection that followed was treated as misfortune rather than consequence. Illness flourished in these conditions. Gastrointestinal diseases spread through contaminated water. Skin infections developed from constant exposure to dirt and parasites. Respiratory problems worsened due to smoke-filled homes and damp environments. These ailments rarely caused immediate death, but they weakened bodies steadily over time. Children were especially affected. Crawling and playing in contaminated spaces exposed them early and often. Diarrhea, fever, and infections were common. Many did not survive early childhood. Those who did often carried long-term weakness into adulthood. High child mortality was accepted as tragic but inevitable. Workplaces offered no refuge.
Tanneries dumped chemicals into rivers. Blacksmiths filled the air with soot and metal dust. Markets overflowed with waste from animals slaughtered on site. Blood, entrails, and refuse were left behind or washed into drains. Food was sold in these environments, exposed to contamination before it reached the home. Medical understanding did not connect these conditions to illness. Disease was blamed on imbalance, fate, or divine will, not waste. Attempts to improve sanitation were rare and often motivated by smell rather than health. Even when streets were cleared, underlying water contamination remained untouched. Seasonal changes worsened sanitation problems. Rain spread filth into wells, summer heat accelerated decay, winter trapped waste under snow only to release it during thaw. Each season brought its own wave of illness, reinforcing the belief that sickness was cyclical and unavoidable. Burial practices added another layer of risk. Graveyards were often located near churches in the center of towns. As populations grew, graves were reused. Decomposition occurred close to living spaces. Runoff from burial grounds contaminated nearby soil and water. Death literally fed illness. Social hierarchy shaped exposure. The poor lived closest to waste, but the wealthy were not immune. Larger homes required more servants, increasing contact. Privies drained into shared spaces. Cleanliness was relative, not absolute. Disease crossed boundaries easily. Fear of disease did not lead to prevention, but to avoidance. Sick people were isolated emotionally, not hygienically. Families continued daily routines. Waste continued to accumulate. Life continued because it had to. Stopping meant starvation. Occasionally, authorities attempted reforms. Streets were ordered to be cleaned, animals were banned from certain areas, but enforcement was inconsistent. Resources were limited. Once immediate discomfort faded, attention moved elsewhere. Illness became background noise. Coughs, sores, fevers, and weakness were constant companions. People adjusted expectations accordingly. A long life was rare. Health was temporary. Sickness did not signal crisis, it signaled normalcy. This normalization dulled urgency. If everyone was sick sometimes, then sickness required no explanation. Sanitation improvements seemed unnecessary or impossible. Effort focused on survival rather than prevention. The result was a feedback loop. Poor sanitation caused illness. Illness weakened populations. Weakened populations lacked energy to improve conditions. Disease thrived in the gap between endurance and understanding. Over generations, bodies adapted in limited ways. Survivors developed some resistance. Communities learned which water sources were less deadly, which seasons were more dangerous, but these adaptations were fragile and local. They did not change the system. Sanitation remained rare because it demanded coordination, knowledge, and long-term planning, luxuries medieval life could not afford. Immediate needs always came first. Waste was tomorrow's problem. Illness was today's burden. And so, medieval people lived immersed in contamination, not because they embraced filth, but because they had no framework to escape it. Illness followed naturally, persistently, and without surprise. In a world where sickness was expected, danger no longer felt exceptional. It blended into daily labor, routine, and environment until risk became inseparable from work itself. And nowhere was that risk more quietly lethal than in the tasks people performed every day simply to survive.
Danger was built into daily work. In the medieval world, work was not separate from danger. It did not merely carry risk, it was constructed around it. Survival depended on labor, and labor quietly shortened lives. People did not clock into jobs designed with safety in mind. They worked in environments shaped by necessity, tradition, and limited resources, where injury and death were not unexpected outcomes, but familiar possibilities. Most medieval people worked from childhood. There was no clear boundary between learning and labor. Children were introduced early to tasks meant for adults, not because society was cruel, but because survival demanded every capable hand. This early exposure meant bodies grew accustomed to strain before they were fully developed. Damage accumulated slowly, often unnoticed until it became permanent. Farming, the backbone of medieval life, was among the most dangerous occupations. Fields were worked with heavy, poorly balanced tools. Plows required physical strength and coordination. Oxen and horses could panic or collapse. Injuries from falls, kicks, and cuts were common. There was no protective gear. A broken bone could mean lifelong disability. An open wound could mean death. Harvest season intensified these risks. Long hours, exhaustion, and urgency pushed bodies beyond limits. Sharp tools moved quickly. Mistakes happened. Fingers were lost. Feet were crushed. Fatigue dulled judgment. Accidents were treated as unfortunate, not preventable. Work had to continue regardless. Blacksmiths faced constant danger from fire and metal. Furnaces burned hot enough to kill instantly. Molten iron splashed unpredictably. Sparks filled the air. Burns were common, severe, and often infected. Smoke damaged lungs. Hearing was lost slowly to constant noise. A long career meant cumulative injury. Construction work offered little safety. Scaffolding was unstable. Ladders were crude. Falls from even modest heights could be fatal. Stones slipped. Beams collapsed. There were no inspections, no standards, no accountability beyond survival. A single misstep could end a life instantly. Milling grain, essential for food production, carried its own hazards. Millstones were massive and unforgiving. Clothing could catch and pull bodies into machinery. Dust filled the air, damaging lungs and increasing explosion risk. Mills were vital, but they quietly consumed workers. Fishing and maritime labor exposed people to unpredictable environments. Boats were small. Weather changed quickly. Drowning was common. Hypothermia killed silently. Survivors often suffered long-term damage from cold and exhaustion. The sea provided food, but it demanded lives in return. Women's labor was no safer, though it was often less visible. Carrying water strained spines. Grinding grain damaged joints. Spinning and weaving caused repetitive injuries. Pregnancy did not pause work. Childbirth injuries compounded existing strain. Women worked through pain because stopping was rarely an option. Domestic labor carried constant risk. Open fires burned inside homes. Cooking caused burns. Smoke inhalation weakened lungs. Heavy lifting damaged backs. Cleaning exposed people to waste and parasites. The home was not a safe space. It was another workplace. Markets and trade involved physical and social danger. Transporting goods meant long journeys over unsafe roads. Banditry existed, but exposure was the greater threat. Cold, hunger, and exhaustion claimed lives quietly. Animals used for transport could injure handlers unexpectedly. Guilds offered some protection through shared knowledge, but they did not eliminate danger. Skills reduced risk, but they also encouraged specialization, trapping workers in harmful routines for life. Expertise prolonged careers, not health. Injuries were rarely treated effectively. Cuts became infected. Fractures healed poorly. Chronic pain was common. People adapted by working through injury rather than resting. Rest meant lost income, hunger, and dependence. Disability was widespread. Limping, missing fingers, damaged vision, and chronic pain were common sights. These conditions were accepted as part of aging, not recognized as workplace injury. Survival meant adaptation, not recovery. Illness confounded work-related danger. Malnutrition weakened bodies. Disease reduced coordination and strength.
People worked while sick because stopping could be fatal in a different way. Exhaustion lowered resistance further, creating a cycle of decline. Seasonal pressures intensified risk. During planting and harvest, speed mattered more than caution. Winter forced dangerous tasks indoors. Summer heat caused dehydration and collapse. Weather dictated labor pace, not safety. Social expectations reinforced endurance. Complaining signaled weakness. Pain was normalized. Strength was measured by tolerance, not longevity. Those who survived longest were admired, not questioned. Death at work was not dramatic. It happened quietly, individually. A fall, an infection, a collapsed lung. Families mourned briefly, then continued. Labor did not pause for loss. Over generations, communities adapted psychologically. Risk was expected. Danger was accepted. Work became inseparable from harm. People did not imagine safer alternatives because none existed. This constant exposure shaped medieval bodies and minds. Strength was valued over health. Survival meant enduring damage until the body failed. Few reached old age intact. Many never reached it at all. What is striking is not how reckless medieval labor was, but how normalized it became. Danger was not an emergency, it was routine. Work killed slowly, quietly, and without protest. And yet, despite this, people continued. They farmed, forged, built, carried, and cooked, not because work was safe, but because survival demanded it. This normalization of danger extended beyond labor itself. The same fire that powered forges and warmed homes also threatened entire towns. And when fire escaped its role as servant, it became one of the most destructive forces medieval people faced.
Fire, a friend that often turned deadly. Fire in the medieval world was both essential and perilous. It warmed homes, cooked food, forged tools, and powered industries. Yet it carried an invisible duality, a servant that could instantly become a destroyer. Unlike disease or starvation, fire moved unpredictably, transforming ordinary spaces into sudden death traps, leaving ruin in its wake. People depended on it daily, yet they had little understanding of how easily it could escape control. In rural homes, open hearths were the center of domestic life. Kitchens were not separate from living spaces, and that closeness amplified risk. Sparks escaped onto straw mats, wooden floors, or dried thatch roofs. Children played near the flames. Animals roamed freely. A single moment of inattention could ignite a disaster. Flames spread faster than any person could respond. Lighting methods were crude. Torches, candles, and rushlights flickered and burned unevenly. Dripping tallow could catch fire unexpectedly. Windows were covered with oiled cloth or shutters instead of glass. Smoke filled the room, causing coughing and weakening lungs over time. Fire provided warmth, yet it constantly eroded health silently. Beyond homes, fire threatened entire villages. Buildings were clustered closely, with wood and thatch dominating construction. A spark from one hearth or forge could ignite neighboring houses within minutes. Streets offered little separation, and water sources were often inadequate for rapid firefighting. A small accident could escalate into total destruction. Industrial use of fire intensified danger. Blacksmiths worked in open forges, handling molten metal without protective gear. Sparks flew, embers bounced unpredictably, and furnaces glowed with temperatures capable of causing instant death. The smoke blackened the air, coating lungs and making vision uncertain. Accidental burns were frequent. Fatal burns were not uncommon. Kilns, bakeries, and breweries relied on steady, controlled heat, yet control was precarious. Wooden supports, straw insulation, and dried earth increased combustibility. Fires in these buildings often started slowly, smoldering unnoticed until they erupted. By the time anyone realized the danger, the blaze had grown beyond human control. Urban centers were especially vulnerable. Streets were narrow, buildings shared walls, attics and upper floors contained flammable materials. Chimneys were primitive and often clogged. A single fire could jump from rooftop to rooftop, consuming entire neighborhoods. Medieval firefighting consisted of bucket brigades and sand, neither of which could halt rapid flames. Watching one's town burn became a familiar horror. Fire also interacted with human error. Careless candle placement, children playing with matches, and inattentive hearth maintenance multiplied risk. People relied on instinct, not prevention. Experience reduced accidents slightly, but no skill could eliminate them entirely. Fire was not an enemy to be defeated, it was a companion to be respected, cautiously tolerated. The psychological dimension was profound. Communities lived with constant awareness of potential disaster. Anxiety over accidental fire affected behavior. Work in proximity to open flames required vigilance at all times. People slept lightly, kept tools close, and monitored stoves and hearths constantly. The ever-present threat shaped daily life. Large-scale fires created broader social consequences. When a house burned, it did not merely destroy a family's possessions, it displaced families, disrupted markets, and consumed food stores. Livestock died, grain went up in smoke. Fire undermined stability slowly, forcing migrations and shifting economic balance. Religious interpretations shaped responses. Some fires were seen as divine punishment. Communities conducted rituals to prevent flames, invoking saints or performing exorcisms on homes and workshops. These rituals offered comfort but did not reduce risk. In fact, focusing on spiritual causes sometimes delayed practical responses. Insurance, as a concept, was rare. Losses were absorbed by families or communities, often through shared labor to rebuild. The wealthy might compensate through material wealth, but rebuilding was labor-intensive and slow. Fire perpetuated vulnerability rather than eliminating it. Those who survived the flames faced long-term consequences. Fires in towns were cyclical. Summer and winter posed different risks. Dry heat and winds made summer especially dangerous. Winter fires, although necessary for warmth, were equally hazardous because of the dry fuel and crowded living conditions. People learned to anticipate seasonal danger, yet anticipation did not prevent catastrophe. Chimney design was rudimentary. Smoke sometimes exited through holes in roofs or small openings. Sparks escaped easily. Homes with multiple stories trapped heat and smoke, accelerating ignition. Once fire started in an upper story, escape routes were limited, often leading to fatalities. Fires were silent instructors. Survivors learned which materials ignited quickly, which tools helped control flames, and which building patterns were most vulnerable. These lessons were transmitted slowly across generations, but change was incremental. Tradition and convenience often outweighed caution. In rural areas, barns and granaries posed special hazards. Stored grain, straw, and hay were highly flammable. Sparks from cooking or smoking could ignite these structures. Once burning, barns were nearly impossible to save. Livestock inside perished quickly. Families lost food, income, and shelter in a single night. Fire also affected agriculture indirectly. Crops were destroyed by accidental blazes spreading from homes or fields. Farmers had to rebuild fences and storage facilities repeatedly. Labor spent extinguishing or repairing damage reduced productive work. Survival depended not just on cultivation, but on mitigating fire's ever-present threat. Even in controlled environments, fire was unpredictable. Lightning could strike buildings. Sparks could drift for meters, landing on thatch roofs. Embers hidden in walls smoldered for days before erupting. Vigilance was constant, exhausting, yet necessary. In times of conflict, fire became a weapon. Armies torched villages to weaken enemies. Civilians became collateral damage. A fire intended as strategy spread indiscriminately, demonstrating that flames were indifferent to intent. Human control was minimal. Destruction was total. Fire altered social dynamics. Communities invested in watch systems, fire bells, and communal bucket brigades. These measures were proactive but limited. Training was informal, cooperation was essential. A lapse in coordination could nullify all efforts, allowing fire to consume homes, food, and lives. Despite all danger, fire remained indispensable. Cooking, heating, metalworking, and lion were impossible without it. People accepted the paradox, a servant essential to life that could, in moments, destroy it entirely. Dependence coexisted with fear. Over time, people became accustomed to the rhythm of fire. They respected it, monitored it, and learned its patterns, but they never conquered it. Accidents persisted. Fatalities were part of life. Fire did not discriminate. Even the most vigilant could fall victim. And when fire escaped control, it reminded communities of the precariousness of existence. Structures, families, livestock, and livelihoods could vanish in minutes. This vulnerability shaped architecture, labor, social organization, and collective memory. Fire was both necessary and lethal, a daily companion whose duality defined a medieval experience. Survival required constant attention, skill, and luck. Lives were balanced on the edge of warmth and destruction. And just as fire claimed homes and possessions, war claimed people, often indiscriminately and with consequences equally slow and pervasive. War didn't just kill soldiers. In the medieval world, war was not confined to battlefields or the clashing of swords. It did not end with the fall of soldiers. Its effects radiated slowly, quietly, through the lives of civilians, shaping survival in ways that were nearly invisible at first. Hunger, disease, displacement, and psychological strain extended the reach of conflict far beyond the armies engaged in combat. Civilians experienced war as a constant undercurrent. Armies required food, shelter, and labor, often appropriating what villagers produced. Crops were requisitioned, livestock taken, and homes commandeered for barracks or storage. Families lost the means to feed themselves. Starvation followed swiftly, sometimes more deadly than the sword itself. Sieges demonstrated the indirect power of war. Towns cut off from trade and water faced slow suffering. Hunger weakened populations. Disease spread rapidly in overcrowded, unsanitary conditions. Walls protected from bullets and arrows, but not from starvation or fever. Civilians became collateral damage, trapped between military necessity and survival instinct. Looting and pillaging were routine. Armies did not distinguish between combatants and non-combatants. Property was seized or destroyed. Tools, clothing, and shelter vanished. Each act of plunder undermined the delicate balance of rural life. People were forced to rebuild while still coping with the ongoing threat of violence. Beyond material loss, war imposed constant fear. Villagers lived with uncertainty about when or where the next attack would occur. Journeys to markets or distant fields carried risk. Ordinary tasks became hazardous. Even staying home offered no guarantee of safety. Fear itself became a form of control, conditioning behavior and limiting survival strategies. Displacement was common. Families fled advancing armies, abandoning homes, fields, and livelihoods. Refugee populations faced exposure, malnutrition, and disease. Temporary settlements became overcrowded, unsanitary, and vulnerable to infection. Survival depended on mobility and luck, not strength or skill. Children were particularly vulnerable. Schools did not exist as we know them. Education was limited to home or trade apprenticeship. Children accompanied adults on labor or flight. Exposure to hunger, violence, and disease shaped childhood into an accelerated course toward adulthood. Innocence was lost, and fragility became second nature. Women bore invisible burdens. They managed households in the absence of men, cared for the sick, and attempted to preserve food supplies. They carried psychological weight alongside physical labor. The loss of male protectors increased vulnerability. Assault and forced labor were constant risks in occupied regions. Survival required endurance, creativity, and quiet vigilance. Illness and malnutrition compounded the effects of war. Starvation weakened immune systems. Diseases spread quickly in displaced populations. Infection followed minor wounds. Fever and diarrhea claimed lives that swords had spared. The battlefield extended invisibly into homes and communities. Infrastructure collapsed. Roads, bridges, mills, and storage facilities were destroyed or neglected. Trade slowed or ceased entirely. Markets could not function. Long-term survival depended on improvisation and scavenging. Communities relied on local knowledge to stretch scarce resources. Mobility became a key determinant of survival. Cultural and social structures eroded. Religious institutions tried to maintain stability, offering charity and refuge, but their reach was limited. Social hierarchies fractured as wealth and land were redistributed violently. Those with influence and resources survived better, but even the privileged felt pressure from instability and scarcity. Psychological impact was profound. Communities learned to expect loss, hunger, and disease. Anxiety and grief were constant companions. Mourning cycles overlapped with survival needs. People endured because stopping meant death. Emotional strain became normalized, shaping behavior and social expectation for generations. War also disrupted labor and production. Skilled workers were conscripted or fled. Fields went untilled. Workshops remained empty. Economic systems slowed dramatically. Villages endured long-term stagnation. Recovery was slow because each generation faced repeated exposure to conflict and its consequences. Rituals and belief adapted to war. Communities turned to prayers, processions, and offerings for protection. Saints and divine forces were invoked to ward off violence. Such practices offered comfort but could not alter reality. Faith became intertwined with survival strategy, not merely spiritual guidance. Epidemics often followed armies. Soldiers carried disease into new regions. Refugees spread infection. Overcrowded and unsanitary camps provided ideal conditions. Mortality increased quietly, away from battle lines. The lethal reach of war was amplified by pathogens moving faster than knowledge or care could respond. Food scarcity and famine were routine consequences. Grain stores were looted or destroyed. Winter brought shortages, and the spring harvest could not compensate. Malnutrition compounded the lethality of disease and reduced resistance to injury. Death was rarely immediate but inevitable over months of deprivation. Even when battles were distant, fear and rumor created social paralysis. Villagers avoided trade routes, leaving fields untended and markets empty. Productivity declined, vulnerability increased. The psychological toll mirrored physical deprivation, creating conditions where survival was constantly threatened. Generations were shaped by repeated exposure. Children learned fear and vigilance early. Adults adapted to scarcity, displacement, and labor shortages. Communities developed informal networks of mutual aid to cope. Social resilience emerged, but fragility remained. Populations could recover slowly, only to face the next wave of conflict. In this sense, war was not a series of discrete events. It was a process, a slow-moving shadow that reshaped towns, labor, and bodies. Death was not the sole measure of its impact. Chronic hunger, disease, displacement, and social disruption extended its reach long after soldiers left the field. civilian endurance was tested in ways that the victorious and the vanquished alike struggled to comprehend. Every village, every family, every individual experienced war in layers, immediate, visible violence, and hidden, ongoing consequences that touched daily life. And while soldiers fell in battle, the majority of suffering occurred quietly, invisibly, far from the triumphs of conquest. Life after conflict was uncertain, fragile, and fraught with danger that was constant, cumulative, and slow-moving.
Religious belief as comfort and risk. In the medieval world, religious belief was both a refuge and a trap. Faith offered guidance, meaning, and solace in an existence defined by hunger, disease, and relentless labor. Yet it could also increase risk, subtly shaping decisions in ways that exposed individuals and communities to danger. Life in the Middle Ages was saturated with the presence of the divine, and belief influenced daily behavior for better and for worse. Churches were central to community life. Villagers gathered not only for worship, but for news, social cohesion, and collective reassurance. The rituals of the church provided rhythm to a chaotic existence. Masses, processions, and feast days structured the calendar. Prayer offered a psychological buffer against fear, providing an explanation for suffering and hope for protection. Faith was a constant companion, its presence woven into the routines of work, leisure, and survival. Yet faith carried implicit risks. Religious gatherings brought people into close physical contact, facilitating the spread of disease. In towns, attending Mass meant sharing space with hundreds of others in enclosed, poorly ventilated buildings. Festivals and processions gathered crowds in narrow streets. Devotion became a vector for contagion, even as it comforted the faithful. The same rituals that soothed the soul could imperil the body. Pilgrimages amplified these dangers. People traveled long distances, often on foot, through forests, mountains, and rivers. Exposure to the elements, insufficient food, and unfamiliar terrain led to exhaustion, injury, or death. Travelers contracted illnesses from strangers. Pilgrimage routes became highways for disease and conflict. Spiritual devotion required physical endurance, and the demands of faith sometimes overrode caution or practicality. Superstition intertwined with religious practice. Amulets, charms, and relics were believed to provide protection, sometimes leading to risk-taking behavior. A traveler might ignore dangerous roads, trusting a saint's blessing to prevent injury. People handled holy objects without knowledge of contamination or hygiene. Reliance on the divine could replace practical judgment, subtly increasing exposure to harm. Confession and penance shaped labor and social participation. Individuals undertook physically taxing acts, fasting, carrying heavy crosses, or performing long pilgrimages to seek absolution or divine favor. Such practices caused exhaustion, malnutrition, and injury. Spiritual aims motivated endurance beyond safe limits. Faith demanded participation, and participation sometimes demanded bodily risk. Clergy themselves were not immune to danger. Monks, priests, and nuns managed food, water, and shelter for large numbers of people, often in confined quarters. They tended the sick during outbreaks. Their spiritual service exposed them to contagion and injury. Many died quietly, their sacrifice unnoticed beyond the community they served. Religious vocation was inseparable from physical vulnerability. Religious belief also guided responses to epidemics. Illness was often interpreted as divine punishment. Communities organized prayer vigils, public penance, and processions to appease God. Such gatherings, while spiritually intended to prevent disease, often facilitated its spread. Fears of divine wrath reinforced behavior that, ironically, increased mortality. Comfort and risk existed simultaneously in these practices. Charitable acts, motivated by faith, could similarly increase exposure to danger. Providing food or shelter to the needy during times of famine or plague meant close contact with the sick.
Hospitals and hospices, often church-run, concentrated vulnerable populations in confined spaces. Good intentions did not eliminate risk. Faith-guided altruism amplified exposure to the same threats that afflicted the wider community. Warfare, too, intersected with religion. Crusades, territorial conflicts, and sectarian violence were justified in spiritual terms. Participation promised salvation, penance, or protection of the soul. Yet soldiers, pilgrims, and supporting civilians faced predictable hazards: hunger, injury, disease, and death. Faith transformed the perception of risk, reframing exposure as purposeful, noble, or necessary. Belief dictated food and health practices. Religious fasting required abstinence from certain foods for extended periods, which could weaken immunity, exacerbate malnutrition, or reduce energy for labor. Observing holy days might interrupt agricultural work, limiting food availability or slowing production. Spiritual calendars shaped practical behavior in ways that had unintended consequences for survival. Fear of divine punishment motivated obedience, often at the expense of safety. People avoided certain behaviors, sometimes reasonable but occasionally detrimental. Wells, rivers, or food sources deemed profane or cursed might be neglected, even if safer. Choice was constrained by spiritual belief, blending morality with survival in complex and sometimes dangerous ways. Religious festivals and saints' days dictated social and economic rhythms. Markets and labor schedules were interrupted by prayer and celebration. This periodic disruption, though culturally meaningful, could have practical consequences. Harvests were delayed, work patterns were uneven, food storage might be insufficient. Life proceeded according to spiritual imperatives, not exclusively material needs. Religious narratives framed mortality. Death was interpreted as God's will, plague as punishment, famine as trial. This perspective offered psychological resilience but limited proactive prevention. Communities might accept suffering as unavoidable, reducing initiative to address preventable causes of illness, hunger, or environmental danger. Education was also shaped by religion. Monasteries and church schools controlled literacy and knowledge dissemination. Secular practical knowledge sometimes took a back seat to theological study. Scientific or medical innovation often was subordinated to spiritual authority. Understanding of natural hazards lagged behind spiritual explanations, prolonging vulnerability. Ritual purification practices existed but were inconsistent. Holy water, blessings, or sanctified spaces offered symbolic protection but rarely mitigated real-world threats. Water sources, living conditions, and sanitation remained unaltered. Faith provided comfort, yet tangible dangers persisted unchanged. Psychological reassurance coexisted with persistent risk. Pilgrimage economies exposed communities to broader dangers. Hosting travelers increased disease exposure. Hospitality obligations were moral imperatives. Villagers risked health and resources to meet religious duty. Generosity was framed as sacred responsibility, not optional. Practical risk was subordinated to spiritual obligation. The cumulative effect of religious practice shaped medieval life profoundly. Faith guided behavior, social norms, and personal decisions. It created cohesion and meaning, providing psychological resilience amidst uncertainty. Yet it also subtly introduced hazards, from disease spread to physical overexertion, hunger, and injury. Survival was inseparable from belief, and belief was inseparable from risk. People learned to navigate this duality. They prayed, fasted, and participated in rituals, while simultaneously adapting to environmental threats, disease, and labor. Experience tempered instinct, but never eliminated vulnerability. Faith offered a framework for understanding misfortune and, inadvertently, a mechanism for exposure. Ultimately, religious belief was a lens through which medieval people interpreted the precariousness of life. It explained suffering, reinforced community bonds, and offered hope, Yet it also shaped behavior in ways that magnified risk, reinforcing a delicate balance between psychological comfort and material danger. And as devotion persisted, life continued under its influence, shaping survival, guiding choices, and quietly intertwining the sacred with the dangerous rhythm of daily existence.
Children grew up surrounded by death. In the medieval world, childhood was not a protected period of innocence. It was a time of exposure to danger, suffering, and mortality. Children grew up surrounded by death, not as an anomaly, but as a routine, pervasive element of daily life. From birth, they encountered the fragility of human existence, the inevitability of illness, and the omnipresent shadow of environmental and social threats. Infant mortality was high. Many children never survived beyond their first year. Families were accustomed to these losses, yet each death carried emotional weight and practical consequences. Newborns were exposed to disease, malnutrition, and unsafe living conditions. Midwives, untrained by modern standards, assisted in birth with limited tools and knowledge. Complications were common, often fatal, and survival depended on a combination of luck, resilience, and the mother's endurance. Nutrition for children was precarious. Breastfeeding was essential, but the quality of maternal health directly affected infants. Supplementary feeding was often improvised, sometimes using contaminated food or water. Malnutrition weakened immunity, leaving children vulnerable to the many illnesses that surrounded them. Families balanced the immediate need for sustenance with the risks inherent in feeding methods and available resources. Disease moved silently through households. Smallpox, measles, dysentery, and other childhood illnesses were common and lethal. Children lived in close proximity to one another and to adults, sharing beds and living spaces. Infections spread quickly. Caregivers, lacking modern knowledge, often inadvertently transmitted disease. Healing was inconsistent and often ineffective, relying on herbal remedies, superstition, or prayer. Sanitation practices exacerbated vulnerability. Floors were dirty, waste accumulated near living spaces, and water sources were often contaminated. Crawling and playing exposed children to parasites and bacteria. The environment itself was a hazard. Disease and death were woven into the physical spaces where children lived, learning to navigate filth, vermin, and contamination as part of daily existence. Work began early. Children assisted in farming, animal husbandry, and household chores. Carrying water, tending livestock, grinding grain, and gathering fuel were routine. These tasks involved exposure to injury, exhaustion, and environmental danger. Labor was survival-driven, not educational. Physical development occurred alongside risk, shaping bodies that were strong but frequently scarred or weakened by accident or disease. Exposure to violence was also common. Armed conflict, raiding, and banditry extended danger into villages and rural areas. Children witnessed injury and death, whether in households, towns, or fields. Fear and vigilance became naturalized behaviors. Observation of mortality taught lessons in caution, avoidance, and endurance from an early age. Loss was not occasional, it was a constant teacher. Siblings, neighbors, and friends died from illness, malnutrition, or accident. Rituals surrounding death were observed, including burial practices, prayers, and communal mourning. Children participated in these ceremonies, absorbing grief while simultaneously learning the practical realities of handling corpses, preparing graves, and acknowledging mortality as a social norm. Education was informal and practical. Skills were transmitted through observation and apprenticeship. Knowledge about survival, labor, and social norms often took precedence over leisure or play.
Even games and stories reflected themes of danger, cunning, and endurance. Lessons were as much about observing what could kill you as what could sustain you. Psychological resilience developed alongside exposure to mortality. Children became accustomed to sights, smells, and sounds of death. Fevered bodies, injuries, and the results of malnutrition were normalized. Emotional coping was necessary for continuation of life. Fear was managed, grief compressed, and curiosity tempered by the constant presence of fragility. The family unit shaped experience. Parents balanced nurturing with survival. Love coexisted with pragmatism. High child mortality necessitated a delicate balance between attachment and preparation for inevitable loss. Households were dynamic sites of protection, instruction, and exposure. Children learned early that survival depended on attentiveness, quick adaptation, and endurance. Religion framed understanding of mortality. Children were taught to interpret death as part of God's plan. Saints, prayers, and ritual observances provided context, solace, and instruction. Spiritual frameworks coexisted with practical lessons about hygiene, work, and avoidance of danger. Faith offered a narrative that made loss comprehensible, even as it did not mitigate material risk. Nutrition, labor, and disease intersected to shape life expectancy. Surviving childhood required both luck and adaptability. Those who survived early exposure to death carried with them practical knowledge about illness, risk, and work. Childhood, in this context, was a period of rapid learning through observation and experience rather than instruction alone. Communities monitored children informally. Elders and neighbors participated in guidance, protection, and intervention when possible. Collective observation helped reduce but never eliminate danger. Social networks functioned as safety nets in a world where mortality was constant, but they could not prevent exposure entirely. Seasonal changes imposed additional pressures. Winter cold, summer heat, drought, and floods increased mortality risk. Children contributed to household survival tasks that were especially demanding during these periods. Exposure to the elements and necessity-based labor intensified physical and psychological challenges. Conflict intersected with childhood exposure. Armies passed through towns and raiders visited fields. Families relocated temporarily, carrying children across dangerous terrain. Displacement, hunger, and exposure compounded risk. Adaptation became a survival mechanism, ingrained through experience rather than theory. Illness and injury were rarely isolated events. Weakness accumulated over time. A minor infection could escalate. A fall could leave lasting disability. Malnutrition reduced resilience. Children observed and internalized these patterns, learning which conditions demanded caution and which could be endured. Even recreational life was shaped by danger. Play often mirrored labor, conflict, or survival scenarios. Wood, tools, and rudimentary weapons were incorporated into games, teaching practical caution. Observation of adult activity during play provided instruction in risk management. Survival skills were imparted early, seamlessly integrated into daily routines. The cumulative effect was a childhood defined by proximity to mortality. Death was frequent, visible, and normalized. Children learned, adapted, and endured. By adolescence, they had observed cycles of illness, loss, labor, and recovery. Experience shaped understanding of vulnerability, resilience, and the precariousness of life. And yet, life continued. Children grew, learned, and participated in labor and survival, building practical skills and psychological resilience. Survival was not guaranteed, but adaptation and observation provided the best chance. Mortality framed experience from the beginning, shaping the next generation to endure the relentless challenges of medieval existence.
Travel was rare because it was deadly. In the medieval world, travel was an undertaking fraught with peril. Journeys, even over relatively short distances, exposed travelers to countless threats. Roads were rough, poorly maintained, and often indistinct. Villages were separated by miles of forest, marsh, or open land. Travelers faced not only environmental hazards, but also the unpredictable human and animal dangers that filled every mile. Travel was not a simple movement from one place to another. It was a slow, cautious negotiation with risk, often undertaken only when necessity outweighed danger. Paths and roads were rudimentary. Dirt tracks became mud in rain, and ruts deepened into traps for wheels and hooves. Bridges were rare or unstable. Crossing rivers and streams required improvisation, fording in shallow areas, balancing on fallen logs, or risking ferry boats with minimal safety. Each obstacle posed the threat of injury, drowning, or fatal delay. A journey could be short in theory, but consume days, leaving travelers exposed to elements and exhaustion. Wild animals were constant threats. Wolves, bears, and packs of scavenging dogs lurked near settlements and along isolated paths. Predation, although infrequent, was a real danger. Livestock or pack animals could be spooked, leading to trampling or loss of vital supplies. Travelers had to remain vigilant, attentive to the subtle signs of predator presence, weather change, or unstable terrain. Survival demanded observation, skill, and sometimes luck. Bandits and robbers multiplied the risk. Rural areas were sparsely populated, and enforcement was inconsistent. Patrols were rare, and local lords' authority often reached only partially along main routes. Travelers could be waylaid, their possessions taken, and their bodies left for chance or mercy. Even small towns could not guarantee safety. Inns and marketplaces carried their own social hazards. Trust, negotiation, and caution were constant companions. Traveling with animals added another layer of challenge. Horses, oxen, and donkeys were essential for carrying goods or aiding mobility, but animals required food, water, and rest. Unfamiliar terrain, long distances, or sudden storms could exhaust them. An overburdened animal or frightened animal could injure or kill its handler. The well-being of animals directly affected human survival, intertwining the fates of human and beast. Weather dictated the pace and safety of travel. Heavy rains turned roads into quagmires. Flooded rivers became impassable, isolating communities and delaying journeys. Cold or snow increased exposure risk. Hypothermia, frostbite, or heat stroke could claim travelers long before starvation or attack did. Survival depended on knowledge of seasons, microclimates, and local terrain. Food and water scarcity shaped decision-making. Travelers could not carry sufficient supplies for long journeys. Foraging was necessary, but unpredictable. Streams might be contaminated, forests could be barren, and fields might be guarded or private. Each day required assessment of what was edible, safe, and sustainable. Mistakes could be fatal. Rest was complicated by danger. Shelters were few and far between. Staying in open fields increased vulnerability to weather, predators, or thieves. Villages provided temporary safety, but lodging was imperfect. Overcrowded inns exposed travelers to disease, poor sanitation, and theft. Sleep came with risk, yet without it, exhaustion increased the likelihood of accidents, injury, or death. Travel was inherently social. Groups often moved together for protection, but companionship did not eliminate danger. Conflicts within groups, competition for scarce resources, and mistrust of strangers could exacerbate peril. Cooperation was essential, yet fragile. Human behavior, unpredictable and self-interested, became another hazard to manage. Health was continuously threatened. Exposure to cold, wet, and exhaustion weakened bodies, lowering immunity. Minor injuries could become infections in the absence of treatment. Blood loss or dehydration could escalate unnoticed.
The unpredictability of illness meant that even well-prepared travelers faced the constant possibility of incapacitation. Journeys were not only physically dangerous, but medically precarious. Children and the elderly rarely traveled alone. They depended on adults for protection, transport, and sustenance. Exposure to travel hazards shaped their development, resilience, and awareness of mortality. Long journeys accelerated maturity, instilled caution, and ingrained knowledge about human and environmental risk. Experience was gained through observation, endurance, and occasional trauma. Trade and commerce created incentives to travel despite danger. Merchants carried goods between towns, often over days or weeks. Profit and necessity outweighed risk. These journeys exposed entire families, livestock, and supplies to theft, predation, and natural hazards. Profit was never guaranteed. Loss was always a potential consequence. Every trip was a calculated negotiation with danger. Religious obligations drove travel in other ways. Pilgrimages required movement over great distances. Spiritual devotion often compelled individuals to take risks they might otherwise avoid. Religious festivals and saints' days prompted temporary migration, placing pilgrims in crowded, unsanitary, and exposed conditions. Faith-guided travel mingled devotion with exposure to environmental, social, and health hazards. War and conflict increased travel risks dramatically. Armies moving through regions disrupted local resources. Roads became unsafe due to troop movement, ambushes, or scorched earth tactics. Refugees fled along supply lines, competing for scarce food and shelter. Travel became a form of survival itself, with every step calculated against human, environmental, and political threats. Geography shaped isolation. Forests, mountains, marshes, and rivers created natural obstacles that slowed movement and heightened danger. Navigational knowledge was limited. Maps were scarce, landmarks unreliable, and travelers often relied on memory, local guides, or intuition. A wrong turn could mean days of exposure in hazardous terrain, with little chance of rescue. Social and political divisions added complexity. Borders between domains were poorly marked. Different laws, languages, and customs could transform strangers into suspects or enemies. Miscommunication, misjudgment, or perceived slights could escalate into violence. Travel required not only physical endurance, but constant social awareness. Seasonal hazards intersected with necessity. Harvest periods, religious festivals, and market days increased traffic, yet roads were crowded, supplies limited, and competition fierce. Traveling at night introduced risks of ambush or accident. Timing dictated strategy and exposure, yet delay often meant lost opportunity, food, or safety. Animals used for transport were vulnerable to disease, injury, and exhaustion. Packs could break down, leaving travelers stranded. Horses could stumble, fall, or panic. Carrying loads too heavy or traveling too long could kill animals and imperil humans reliant on them. Travelers were continually negotiating the delicate balance between endurance, speed, and care. The psychological toll was profound. Anticipation of danger created constant tension. Travelers learned to expect attack, injury, illness, or delay. Vigilance was continuous. Stress, fear, and uncertainty were as much hazards as wolves, bandits, or storms. Mental resilience became an essential survival skill. Communication was limited. Messages traveled slowly. Warnings often arrived too late. Travelers relied on rumor, observation, and local guidance. Information gaps could transform ordinary journeys into deadly misadventures. Risk assessment depended heavily on experience and communal knowledge. Accidents, disease, and exposure made travel one of the slowest and most dangerous activities in medieval life. For most people, journeys were undertaken only when necessity compelled, to reach markets, relatives, religious sites, or distant work. The cost of failure was high. The benefits, though sometimes substantial, were rarely guaranteed. Travel's dangers reinforced the isolation of villages, towns, and communities.
Most people remained close to home, rarely venturing beyond familiar fields or paths. Isolation offered some protection from external hazards, but limited access to trade, information, and opportunity. Survival required weighing the risks of movement against the dangers of stagnation. The cumulative effect was a population largely sedentary, cautious, and tightly bound to familiar terrain. Those who traveled did so with preparation, vigilance, and an understanding that danger was not an anomaly, it was the default. Every journey demanded negotiation with humans, animals, weather, and terrain, making mobility an exception rather than the rule. And as travel remained perilous, so too did isolation preserve vulnerability. Communities protected themselves from distant threats, yet remained exposed to
Weather could decide who lived and who didn't. In the medieval world, weather was not a background condition, it was a powerful, unpredictable force that could determine life or death. Unlike controlled modern environments, medieval people lived in direct dialogue with the elements. The seasons dictated labor, food supply, health, and social stability. Storms, droughts, frost, floods, and unexpected climatic shifts were not merely inconveniences, they were existential threats, capable of reshaping communities and decimating populations. Winter brought challenges that began even before the first snowfall. Cold weather increased fuel needs, requiring firewood, peat, or coal in quantities that strained labor and resources. Families worked long hours to gather and store sufficient supplies, often sacrificing rest, nutrition, or labor on other tasks. Without adequate preparation, frostbite, hypothermia, and starvation could claim lives quietly, especially among children, the elderly, and the ill. Snowstorms and ice rendered roads impassable, isolating communities from markets, neighbors, and critical resources. Grain deliveries, livestock movement, and trade ceased. People relied on stored supplies, yet even these could become insufficient in prolonged periods of extreme cold. Isolation compounded vulnerability. Illness could not be treated effectively. Food scarcity became immediate, and emergency support was limited or non-existent. Spring was a season of precarious transition. Melting snow and early rains brought flooding to rivers and lowlands, washing away crops, roads, and dwellings. Fields could become waterlogged, delaying planting and reducing yields. Livestock might be swept away or drowned. Even in good years, unpredictability of rainfall required constant vigilance and adjustment. Failure to adapt could trigger famine, illness, and economic instability. Summer, often imagined as a time of abundance, carried its own risks. Drought could kill crops and reduce grazing land, leading to malnutrition and food insecurity. Heat waves increased mortality from dehydration and heat stroke, particularly among laborers, travelers, and vulnerable populations. Fires, both accidental and natural, became more likely during dry periods. Weather dictated activity, often forcing people into dangerous conditions for survival. Storms, wind, and lightning were sources of immediate peril. Homes constructed from wood, straw, and earth were highly vulnerable. A single lightning strike could ignite thatched roofs, barns, or churches. Flooding could destroy dwellings and stored food. Even small storms disrupted labor schedules, supply chains, and social cohesion. Communities learned to anticipate seasonal patterns, yet anomalies, early frosts, sudden rains, or unexpected drought could negate preparation entirely. Rainfall affected not only crops, but also human health. Waterborne diseases spread during periods of heavy rain, contaminating wells and rivers. Mud and stagnant pools created breeding grounds for insects that transmitted illness. Wet conditions increased exposure to hypothermia, respiratory illness, and chronic infections. Labor had to continue despite discomfort and risk, as failure to plant, harvest, or maintain structures threatened long-term survival. Timing dictated the difference between abundance and scarcity. Weather also intersected with travel and trade. Rivers could become impassable, roads could become quagmires. Merchants, pilgrims, and laborers faced heightened danger from storms, floods, or heat. Exposure to the elements increased physical strain, illness, and injury. Planning a journey required not only knowledge of terrain and social conditions, but also precise anticipation of climate, a luxury often unavailable. Communities developed coping strategies, many of which were slow, communal, and adaptive. Storage of grain, stockpiling of firewood, and collective maintenance of irrigation or drainage systems mitigated some risks. Shared knowledge of seasonal patterns, local microclimates, and environmental indicators became essential. Despite preparation, however, weather retained the ability to surprise, disrupt, and destroy. Mortality from weather-related causes was often slow and cumulative. Frostbite might begin in toes and fingers before systemic effects became apparent. Malnutrition weakened resilience against infection. Floods contaminated water, triggering outbreaks weeks later. The impact was rarely immediate, but persistent and unrelenting. Communities lived with the awareness that the elements could kill silently and gradually. Weather also influenced social and economic inequality. Wealthier households could store more food, build sturdier dwellings, and insulate themselves from extremes. Poorer families were exposed disproportionately, lacking materials, labor, or access to safer locations. Seasonal extremes magnified existing disparities, determining who survived and who succumbed. Children and the elderly were especially vulnerable. Their bodies lacked the full capacity to regulate temperature, resist infection, or endure exhaustion. Exposure to cold, heat, or flooding frequently led to injury or death. Labor, nutrition, and protection were critical, yet often insufficient. Survival depended on a combination of community support, parental care, and fortuitous timing. Cultural and religious practices intersected with weather. Festivals, planting rituals, and processions were scheduled according to the calendar and seasonal patterns. Deviations caused anxiety and adjustment. Rain or drought could be interpreted as divine favor or punishment, shaping human responses to environmental stress. These interpretations guided behavior, sometimes mitigating risk, sometimes amplifying it. Repeated exposure to severe weather shaped experience, knowledge, and adaptation. Generations observed signs of approaching storms, frost, or drought, developing informal methods to predict and respond. Yet no amount of observation could entirely eliminate risk. Every year, communities faced uncertainty, testing resilience and resourcefulness. The unpredictability of weather intertwined with all aspects of medieval life: agriculture, labor, travel, health, and social structure. Survival required constant negotiation with these forces, balancing human effort against natural unpredictability. Weather was both a silent partner in subsistence and a hidden executor of mortality. Ultimately, life in the medieval period was inseparable from climatic conditions. Every decision, from what to plant to when to travel, carried implicit awareness of environmental risk. Those who survived adapted through observation, labor, cooperation, and cautious optimism. Those who failed were claimed quietly, removed from daily life, remembered in communal memory as examples of nature's supremacy. And as weather determined survival on a macro scale, so too did rumors, disease, and social dynamics determine human fortunes on a micro scale, quietly shaping the rhythm of life, labor, and death within every village, hamlet, and isolated homestead.
Rumor spread faster than truth. In the medieval world, information traveled slowly and unreliably, yet its consequences were immediate and profound. Rumors spread faster than truth, carried by word of mouth, observation, and speculation. Without newspapers, printed books, or rapid communication, people relied on neighbors, travelers, and clergy to convey knowledge. Each story, whether factual, exaggerated, or wholly false, shaped behavior, influenced survival, and often determined life or death. In small villages, gossip was the primary mechanism for sharing news. A merchant returning from the next town could bring information about harvest yields, tax demands, or disease outbreaks. Stories were interpreted and repeated according to personal bias, memory, and social dynamics. Accuracy was rarely guaranteed. Each retelling carried embellishment or omission, gradually transforming fact into narrative. Disease, in particular, was fertile ground for rumor. The appearance of fever, rash, or death could prompt stories of plague, curses, or divine punishment. Villagers might flee, isolate themselves, or abandon homes based on incomplete or incorrect information. Conversely, failure to recognize true danger could result in the rapid spread of illness. Perception shaped action, and perception often diverged from reality. Misinformation about enemies or bandits could provoke panic. Tales of raiders traveling faster than the imagination spread quickly. Communities might fortify settlements, flee, or deny access to outsiders. Resources could be diverted to defensive measures in response to imaginary threats, while genuine dangers remained unaddressed. Fear amplified rumors, making them instruments of control as well as confusion. Weather reports, or the lack thereof, were similarly unreliable. Early frost, drought, or storm could be interpreted as divine punishment, a harbinger of famine, or the result of enemy action. Villagers relied on second-hand accounts, observation, and symbolic reasoning. The combination of uncertainty and rumor shaped agricultural decisions, often in ways that amplified risk rather than mitigating it. Religious belief intersected with rumor. Tales of miracles, curses, or saintly protection circulated rapidly. Faith encouraged acceptance of such narratives as truth, giving them authority and immediacy. Pilgrimages, fasting, or prayers were sometimes prompted by unverified reports of divine favor or wrath. While spiritually reinforcing, these actions occasionally exposed communities to unnecessary hardship, physical risk, or resource depletion. Travelers, while sources of information, were also conduits of distortion. A journey through distant villages allowed observation, yet each person filtered what they saw through personal experience, memory, and expectation. A minor disagreement could become a feud. A small fire could be interpreted as arson. Exaggeration was natural, even inevitable, and often served social or psychological purposes. Political and social tensions magnified the impact of rumor. Tax collectors, lords, or local officials were often the subjects of exaggerated stories. Tales of corruption, excessive demands, or brutality circulated quickly, prompting resistance or flight. Yet, whether fully accurate or not, these stories influenced behavior as tangibly as any factual report. People acted based on the perceived rather than the actual reality. Markets were hubs of rumor. Traders and merchants shared news about prices, crop yields, and distant conflicts. Information about scarcity or abundance influenced buying, selling, and storage. Rumor could create shortages or surpluses artificially, as fear or hope prompted overreaction. Economic behavior was intimately tied to perception, demonstrating the tangible power of unverified information. Religious leaders themselves contributed to the spread of rumor, often inadvertently. Sermons interpreted distant events or natural phenomena through moral or spiritual lenses, emphasizing divine reward or punishment. Villagers absorbed these messages, sometimes adapting behavior in ways that affected survival, labor, or risk exposure. Rumor and faith intertwined, reinforcing social cohesion while amplifying vulnerability. Education, or its absence, shaped susceptibility. Literacy was rare, access to written records limited.
Oral transmission dominated knowledge acquisition. Facts could not be verified, leaving individuals dependent on community consensus. This social network of information was both protective and hazardous. Consensus could encourage correct action or propagate falsehood. Rumor affected responses to famine. Word of crop failure, hoarding, or impending scarcity spread quickly. Communities might act preemptively, abandoning fields, hoarding grain, or fleeing. Sometimes these measures were justified, sometimes they were unnecessary. Either way, rumor dictated behavior, demonstrating the thin line between prudent action and panic-driven mismanagement. Disease, famine, and natural disasters were particularly sensitive to exaggeration. The perception of threat often outpaced its reality. Villagers interpreted signals, odd weather, sudden deaths, or malnourished animals as evidence of impending catastrophe. Decisions were made based on incomplete information. The speed of rumor amplified consequences, sometimes saving lives, sometimes endangering them further. Travelers carried both rumor and risk. A report of plague in a neighboring town might prompt flight, relocation, or abandonment of resources. Conversely, false reassurance could lead to neglect of precautionary measures. The social transmission of information was continuous, shaping decisions in real time, with immediate effects on survival. Rumors also influenced social cohesion. Shared narratives fostered community solidarity, enabling cooperative action in response to perceived threats. Conversely, they could provoke distrust, isolation, or conflict. Fear magnified messages, repetition reinforced belief. Communities were simultaneously strengthened and endangered by the information they transmitted. The speed of rumor often exceeded the pace of verification. Decisions had to be made without certainty, relying on trust, observation, and social consensus. Action preceded confirmation. The lag between perception and fact created a world where misinterpretation could be as deadly as disease or famine. Survival depended as much on navigating information as on navigating the physical environment. Children learned the power and danger of rumor early. Tales of illness, bandits, storms, or miracles circulated in homes, schools, and marketplaces. Young observers internalized both the content and social function of these stories, developing skills in discernment, caution, and anticipation. Rumor became an integral part of education in survival, shaping perception and behavior from an early age. Conflict amplified rumor. Armies, disputes over land, or local feuds generated stories that traveled faster than facts could be checked. Villagers adapted defensively, reinforcing fortifications, avoiding travel, or stockpiling resources based on hearsay. These actions, while often prudent, sometimes misallocated effort, energy, or attention. Rumors influenced the perception of mortality. Stories about plague, famine, or bandits created anticipatory fear. Communities responded collectively, adjusting behavior, social interaction, and resource allocation. These adjustments could save lives or, paradoxically, create new vulnerabilities. The gap between reality and perception was as critical as the physical threats themselves. Ultimately, in a world without rapid communication, rumor became a force as tangible as the elements, disease, or labor. The spread of information shaped social, economic, and survival outcomes. Villagers learned to navigate rumor, developing experience-based judgment while acknowledging the inherent uncertainty of any story. Life depended on assessing the reliability of human observation as carefully as the fertility of fields, the danger of travel, or the unpredictability of weather. And as stories traveled faster than truth, communities learned to adapt to uncertainty, balancing fear, action, and survival in an environment where perception could determine fate as decisively as any natural or human hazard.
Entire villages could vanish quietly. In the medieval world, the disappearance of entire villages was not always marked by battle or catastrophe. It often occurred quietly, subtly, and without dramatic announcement.
A village could fade from the map over decades, leaving only traces in memory, land boundaries, and written records. The processes behind such disappearances were varied. Famine, disease, environmental change, social shifts, and economic pressures all played a role. Survival was fragile, and the absence of resilience could erase communities without notice. Famine was a silent eroder of villages. Crop failure, repeated drought, or soil depletion reduced food availability incrementally. Families might relocate temporarily, leaving behind homes to salvage what they could. Gradually, departures accumulated until the village no longer supported a sustainable population. Abandonment was often a pragmatic response, a slow recognition that resources and risk no longer aligned with continued habitation. Disease contributed significantly to disappearance. Epidemics could wipe out a majority of a settlement over months or years. Plague, dysentery, or smallpox spread rapidly, particularly in tightly clustered dwellings with poor sanitation. The sick often remained at home, cared for by family members, who themselves became vulnerable. Mortality could exceed the community's capacity to recover, leaving homes empty and fields untended. Environmental changes, both sudden and gradual, shaped abandonment. Rivers changed course, making water sources inaccessible. Floods destroyed arable land or transport routes. Soil exhaustion reduced agricultural yield, leaving families unable to sustain themselves. Villages in marginal areas were especially susceptible. Even subtle shifts, erosion, rising water tables, encroaching forests, could render long-inhabited sites untenable over decades. Economic forces influenced settlement patterns. Trade routes shifted, markets declined, or the demand for local produce fell. Communities dependent on commerce, craft, or specific agricultural niches found survival increasingly difficult. Without viable economic support, families migrated to areas with better prospects. The result was the slow, quiet hollowing out of villages that once thrived. Social factors also played a role. Disputes over land, feuds between families, or changes in local governance could encourage relocation. Lords might consolidate holdings, evicting tenants or repurposing land. Religious or political pressures could lead to migration, leaving homes and farms deserted. The movement of people, voluntary or coerced, gradually erased established settlements. Children and the elderly often felt these pressures acutely. Families weighed survival against attachment to place. The youngest might be sent ahead to safer areas or fostered elsewhere. Elderly members who could not move remained, their absence often unrecorded when the village dissolved. The demographic impact of these slow migrations accelerated the vanishing of communities. Physical decay mirrored population decline. Roofs collapsed, walls crumbled, and paths became overgrown. Without human maintenance, structures fell into disrepair. Fields reverted to scrub or forest. Wells became contaminated or silted. Nature reclaimed land swiftly in the absence of cultivation. Within decades, what was once a vibrant community became indistinguishable from the surrounding landscape. Documentation of vanished villages was scarce. Medieval records were inconsistent, often focusing on taxation, legal matters, or ecclesiastical oversight rather than detailed demographics. When villages disappeared, surviving records noted only absence, a missing parish, uncollected rents, or abandoned land entries. Memory, oral tradition, and archaeological trace remained the only testimony to the community that had existed. Religious life followed population. Churches were abandoned when congregations dwindled. Bells fell silent, priests relocated to active parishes. Ritual, central to medieval social cohesion, ceased, accelerating the perception of absence. Religious spaces, once the heart of village life, became silent markers of demographic change, sometimes standing for decades as reminders of vanished communities. Labor practices were affected by gradual disappearance. Fields left untended became fallow, irrigation systems degraded, livestock numbers declined. The practical skills embedded in local knowledge, crop rotation, seed selection, animal husbandry, were lost when families left or perished. Surviving members carried this knowledge with them, diffusing cultural and agricultural practices, but erasing the original settlement. Isolation increased risk during decline. Villages on marginal land were less connected to trade, information, or support. As populations thinned, communal tasks, repairing bridges, maintaining dikes, clearing roads, became unsustainable. Isolation reinforced vulnerability, encouraging further migration and accelerating the disappearance of the settlement. Conflict occasionally coincided with gradual vanishing. Raids, skirmishes, or broader warfare could destabilize already fragile communities. A single attack might not destroy a village, but it could trigger outmigration. Survivors left for safer areas, and over time the settlement emptied quietly rather than being obliterated in a single event. Environmental stressors often compounded social factors. Drought or flood could amplify food insecurity, prompting families to seek more fertile areas. Soil exhaustion or deforestation made long-term habitation difficult. The interplay of ecological and human pressures created conditions in which survival became improbable, leading to abandonment without dramatic crisis. Psychological impacts were significant. Witnessing neighbors leave or die created fear and uncertainty. Remaining villagers confronted not only practical challenges, but social and emotional strain. Decisions to relocate, abandon land, or consolidate households were informed by perception as much as necessity. The human response to uncertainty was as important as environmental or economic factors. Trade and communication networks influenced permanence. Villages on declining routes lost markets and access to goods. Isolation increased risk from famine, disease, and predation. Conversely, settlements near growing towns or new trade routes could absorb migrants and sustain life. Patterns of movement and abandonment were tied to regional economic geography, not solely local circumstances. Survival depended on adaptability. Those who could move, consolidate resources, or integrate into neighboring communities survived. Others, unable or unwilling to adapt, were gradually erased. The quiet disappearance of villages reflected the delicate balance between human resilience, environmental limits, and social opportunity. It was survival by migration, not by fortitude alone. Archaeological evidence reveals traces of vanished villages. Foundations, earthworks, and residual pottery indicate former habitation. These sites, often overgrown or buried, offer glimpses of daily life, social structure, and adaptation. While the villages themselves disappeared from maps, material remains testify to their existence, quietly preserving history in the landscape. The process was often generational. Parents moved ahead, children followed, and elders remained until death or compelled relocation. Knowledge, culture, and labor were diffused across the region, maintaining continuity while erasing original sites. The memory of the village persisted in social networks as physical presence faded. Ultimately, entire villages could vanish without drama, war, or fire. The disappearance was gradual, influenced by cumulative pressures, ecological, social, economic, and health-related. Life in medieval Europe was precarious. Settlement survival depended on constant adaptation, vigilance, and resourcefulness. The quiet erasure of communities was a reminder of the fragility of human habitation in a world dominated by forces beyond individual control. And as villages disappeared quietly, the cumulative effect shaped regional patterns, population distribution, and cultural memory. Landscapes held traces of human persistence and failure, serving as silent testimony to the delicate balance between survival, adaptation, and the inexorable pressures of the medieval world.
Why humanity didn't actually go extinct. Despite the overwhelming odds, humanity persisted through the medieval period. The centuries were marked by famine, disease, warfare, environmental unpredictability, and social instability, yet people continued to survive, reproduce, and adapt. This endurance was not the result of foresight or planning alone, but a combination of resilience, improvisation, and incremental adaptation to circumstances that often seemed insurmountable. Humanity's survival was quiet, piecemeal, and uncelebrated, emerging from the accumulation of small, persistent decisions made in the face of constant threat. Adaptation to disease was a critical factor. Populations learned, often through painful experience, how to respond to plagues and epidemics. Communities developed rudimentary quarantine measures, avoided contaminated areas, and recognized patterns in the spread of illness. While understanding was limited, observation, trial, and error produced strategies that reduced mortality rates over time. The collective memory of exposure to disease informed decision-making for generations. Nutrition and agricultural practices gradually improved. Crops were diversified, rotation methods refined, and storage techniques enhanced to reduce spoilage. Families observed which planting schedules and soil management techniques yielded the most reliable harvests. Incremental changes, transmitted through oral tradition, apprenticeship, and observation, allowed populations to maintain more consistent access to food, improving resilience to famine and environmental fluctuations. Social networks provided protection and support. Families, villages, and regional alliances functioned as survival mechanisms. Knowledge, labor, and resources were pooled. When local crises occurred, these networks enabled redistribution of food, assistance with labor, and support during illness. Human cooperation was critical. Individuals acting alone were far more vulnerable to the cumulative dangers of the medieval world. Mobility, when cautiously managed, ensured survival. Migration in response to environmental degradation, social tension, or economic opportunity allowed people to seek areas with more favorable conditions. Although travel was dangerous, it enabled humans to avoid localized extinction. Strategic relocation, often guided by observation, rumor, or inherited knowledge, provided communities with a mechanism to endure changing circumstances. Children learned survival from an early age. Observation of labor, illness, and death provided practical education in risk management. Skills in foraging, farming, and navigation were transmitted through everyday activities rather than formal instruction. By the time adolescence arrived, young people had accumulated knowledge essential for navigating life in a dangerous and unpredictable environment. Cultural practices reinforced adaptation. Religious and social rituals, festivals, and community observances provided both psychological and practical frameworks for managing risk. Festivals, for example, aligned labor with seasonal cycles, reinforcing collective effort and resource sharing. Religious observance encouraged care for neighbors and adherence to norms that indirectly enhanced survival, such as attention to hygiene, sharing food, and monitoring community health. Incremental technological innovation contributed as well. Improved tools, irrigation systems, and building techniques allowed more effective use of land, water, and labor. Simple yet effective adaptations, such as sturdier housing materials or drainage systems, mitigated environmental threats.
Incremental improvements accumulated over generations, creating subtle but significant advantages in survival and resilience. Observation of natural patterns was critical. Communities learned to interpret seasonal changes, animal behavior, and environmental signals. Knowledge of rainfall, frost, river behavior, and disease patterns allowed anticipatory action. Although prediction was never perfect, even modest foresight reduced mortality. Generational memory transmitted understanding of the relationship between human activity and environmental constraints, creating continuity in survival strategies. Human immune system adapted gradually to endemic diseases. Repeated exposure to pathogens increased resistance within populations. While plagues and epidemics still claimed many lives, surviving individuals and communities developed a measure of inherited resilience. This biological adaptation, combined with social strategies and practical knowledge, strengthened the long-term persistence of humanity. Flexibility in labor and settlement contributed to survival. Villagers could shift fields, modify diets, or diversify production in response to scarcity. Temporary relocation or expansion of trade networks allowed communities to mitigate environmental, social, and economic pressures. This adaptive flexibility prevented total collapse even when isolated disasters struck, demonstrating that survival was not rigid but responsive. Cumulative improvements in hygiene and medicine, however rudimentary, contributed to long-term survival. Awareness of water contamination, the use of herbal remedies, and isolation of the sick reduced mortality. Knowledge of medicinal plants, first aid, and basic wound care, though inconsistent, was transmitted through families and communities, gradually increasing resilience. The cumulative effect of adaptation, observation, and incremental improvement was remarkable. Despite living in a world rife with threats, environmental, biological, social, and technological, humans persisted. Survival was not heroic or dramatic, but slow, continuous, and uncelebrated. Life endured because people responded incrementally to threats, adjusted behavior to circumstances, and relied on collective knowledge to navigate a world dominated by uncertainty and risk. Cultural memory preserved the lessons of survival. Stories, myths, rituals, and local customs encoded practical knowledge about food, labor, disease, and social dynamics. Even as circumstances changed, these cultural repositories provided guidance. Generations benefited from the experience of predecessors, often without conscious awareness of the depth or origin of the knowledge. Ultimately, humanity persisted through a combination of practical adaptation, social cooperation, and cautious observation. Survival was not heroic or dramatic, but slow, continuous, and uncelebrated. Life endured because people responded incrementally to threats, adjusted behavior to circumstances, and relied on collective knowledge to navigate a world dominated by uncertainty and risk. And so, humanity did not go extinct. The species survived because people observed, learned, and adapted, because communities cooperated and shared resources, because generations transmitted knowledge and wisdom through everyday practice. Persistence was unremarkable, quiet, and cumulative, a testament to the resilience of ordinary human life in extraordinary circumstances.
Small changes that slowly saved lives. In the medieval world, survival was often a matter of incremental adjustments, subtle improvements, and seemingly minor decisions. While monumental events, plagues, famines, or wars dominated the historical record, much of what preserved life was the accumulation of small, often unnoticed changes. These changes were not the product of centralized planning or scientific knowledge, but emerged through observation, experience, and the quiet ingenuity of ordinary people responding to the challenges of daily existence.
Food preservation was one area where small changes made a measurable difference. Simple techniques such as drying herbs, smoking meat, or fermenting vegetables reduced spoilage and extended the edible life of essential provisions. Families experimented with storage methods, clay jars, cellars, and cool underground spaces to maintain food quality. Each adaptation decreased the likelihood of starvation during poor harvests, illustrating the power of subtle, incremental improvement in survival. Hygiene practices, while rudimentary, evolved over time. Awareness that clean water, avoidance of stagnant pools, and basic washing reduced disease transmission gradually became common in many communities. Even small habits, rinsing dishes, boiling water, washing hands after labor, could reduce infection risk. While medieval medicine lacked formal understanding of germs, experience revealed patterns. Communities that maintained basic cleanliness often fared better in the face of epidemic disease. Agricultural innovations were modest but significant. Crop rotation, the careful selection of seeds, and the timing of planting according to local climate observations improved yield reliability. Villagers shared practical knowledge: which seeds sprouted best after winter, which fields held water well, and how to avoid soil exhaustion. Incremental adjustments to labor schedules, field placement, and livestock grazing reduced vulnerability to famine, one small step at a time. Animal care evolved similarly. Livestock were vital for food, labor, and transport, and subtle improvements in feeding, shelter, and breeding had cascading benefits. Farmers noticed that certain practices increased survival rates among animals, indirectly enhancing human food security. These practices spread slowly, through observation and example, rather than formal instruction, illustrating the cumulative impact of minor adjustments. Housing improvements emerged from experience. Simple measures, raising floors above damp ground, reinforcing thatched roofs, building rudimentary chimneys, mitigated exposure to cold, wet, and fire. Each enhancement slightly increased the probability of survival during harsh winters, storms, or accidental fires. Houses were seldom designed perfectly. They evolved slowly, with each generation learning from the failures of the last. Labor organization adapted to human limitation. Awareness of fatigue, repetitive strain, and exposure risks prompted incremental adjustments. Farmers and laborers learned to rest strategically, stagger work among groups, and rotate tasks to reduce injury and exhaustion. These small adaptations, though often invisible, reduced accidents and illness, contributing to the overall resilience of communities. Observation of local flora and fauna informed survival. People learned which plants were edible, which herbs had medicinal properties, and which wild animals posed threats. Knowledge of seasonal patterns in wildlife behavior guided hunting, foraging, and protective measures. Incremental learning over generations gradually accumulated into effective survival strategies, often encoded in stories, customs, and oral instruction. Community cooperation facilitated these small changes. Shared labor in maintaining irrigation, repairing roads, and managing common lands enhanced resilience. Collective observation of environmental conditions, flooding patterns, soil fertility, disease outbreaks allowed communities to implement modest interventions that reduced risk. Collective aid and knowledge sharing amplified the impact of minor adjustments, creating a networked approach to survival. Medical practice, while primitive, gradually incorporated lessons from experience. Herbal remedies, policies, and basic hygiene interventions were refined through trial and observation.
Even minor shifts, boiling water for consumption, isolating the sick, or applying particular herbs reduced mortality. While outcomes were inconsistent, the accumulation of these small adjustments had significant cumulative effects over time. Behavioral adaptation was equally important. People learned to avoid dangerous terrain, travel during safer periods, and recognize early signs of illness. Awareness of risk, transmitted through observation and oral teaching, gradually became part of the behavioral repertoire necessary for survival. These simple, often unconscious practices, yet they saved countless lives by preventing exposure to danger. Food storage strategies improved incrementally. Villagers discovered that earthen pits, elevated granaries, and sealed containers reduced spoilage and rodent predation. Small modifications in storage location, timing of harvest, and rotation of stock made a significant difference during lean years. Communities that implemented these adjustments experienced more stable nutrition and lower mortality, illustrating the cumulative value of minor interventions. Social practices reinforced indirectly. Norms around sharing food, caring for the vulnerable, and collective response to environmental hazards increased the likelihood of community persistence. Small acts of cooperation, helping a neighbor repair a roof, sharing surplus grain, or assisting with childcare, enhanced resilience against unpredictable threats. Survival, in this context, was a social achievement as much as an individual one. Travel practices evolved slowly. People learned to move cautiously, to prepare adequately, and to anticipate seasonal hazards. Even minor improvements in route selection, timing, or companion arrangements reduced risk. Over generations, these adjustments accumulated, enabling safer movement of people and resources across regions, supporting survival indirectly through the maintenance of trade, communication, and social networks. Incremental improvements in shelter extended beyond individual homes. Fortifications, watch posts, and community infrastructure evolved gradually in response to threat perception. Each enhancement, however small, reduced exposure to human and environmental hazards. Collective adaptation, rather than grand design, reinforced security, demonstrating the importance of small, distributed actions over monumental intervention. Dietary diversification, informed by experience and observation, contributed to resilience. People discovered new edible plants, improved food combinations, and balanced nutrition with availability. Small adjustments, substituting one crop for another, supplementing with foraged foods, reduced malnutrition and enhanced the capacity to withstand environmental stress. Survival was a gradual negotiation with available resources. Water management evolved in modest increments. Communities learned to protect wells from contamination, divert runoff, and recognize safe drinking sources. Even simple practices, such as elevated water storage or covering wells, had tangible effects on health. These adaptations were often unnoticed in historical accounts, yet they had profound implications for mortality and disease prevention. Clothing and personal protection adapted slowly to environmental realities. Layering, use of local materials, and incremental improvements in construction reduced exposure to cold, wet, and sun. Families adjusted clothing choices seasonally, observed wear patterns, and developed methods to extend garment life. These small adjustments, repeated across generations, improved comfort, survival, and resilience. Observation of disease patterns informed responses. People learned which symptoms preceded outbreaks, how disease spread, and which practices mitigated risk.
Even without understanding germ theory, behavioral changes such as isolation of the sick, avoidance of contaminated food or water, and selective movement reduced mortality. Experience became the foundation for adaptive strategies, demonstrating the power of incremental.
A world that endured by accident, not design. By the end of the medieval period, it was evident that humanity had endured, not because of careful planning, foresight, or design, but largely through a series of accidents, adaptations, and sheer persistence. Life had continued in a precarious balance, subject to forces beyond control: famine, disease, climate, fire, war, and misfortune. Yet people lived on, building and rebuilding, adjusting to circumstances as they came, and learning slowly from the cumulative consequences of trial and error. The endurance of society was a testament not to brilliance, but to survival instinct and human tenacity. The persistence of life was often more a product of necessity than ingenuity. Villagers replanted fields after drought, repaired roofs after storms, and replanned trade routes after floods. Every action was reactive rather than proactive. Decisions were made from experience and immediate need, not from an overarching understanding of survival on a global scale. Humanity had no master plan, yet the species continued. It endured because people acted, however imperfectly, in the moment to safeguard what they could. Fortunes, both individual and communal, were shaped by unpredictable forces. One family's survival might hinge on a slightly better harvest, a neighbor's insight into soil management, or a decision to flee before a flood reached its peak. One missed frost or an errant fire could doom another. Survival was never guaranteed. That it persisted at all was remarkable, an outcome of countless small decisions accumulating across time and space. This accidental endurance was reinforced by human adaptability. Communities learned to read environmental signs, anticipate seasonal shifts, and adjust agricultural, social, and domestic practices accordingly. Even when knowledge was partial or erroneous, the very act of observation and adjustment increased chances of persistence. People moved when conditions worsened, diversified food sources, and reorganized labor to meet immediate demands, often without understanding the broader principles at work. Adaptation emerged naturally as a byproduct of necessity. The slow accumulation of practical knowledge played a critical role. Families learned which seeds thrived under varying rainfall, which herbs alleviated fevers, and how livestock survived harsh winters. Such knowledge was often local and anecdotal, transmitted orally from one generation to the next. It was rarely systematized, yet it was effective. The medieval world did not survive because it was designed to. It survived because humans learned incrementally from past failures, internalized lessons, and acted upon them. Communities themselves were fragile structures, existing in constant tension with environmental and social forces. Villages were susceptible to disease, abandonment, and the consequences of misfortune. Trade, communication, and religious practice helped knit society together, but they were insufficient to prevent disaster. That any villages persisted at all was an accidental triumph of circumstance, chance resilience, and human effort. Even daily life was governed by contingency. Fire provided warmth and cooked food, yet could destroy homes. Roads allowed trade and communication, yet were dangerous. Wells offered water, yet could carry disease. The balance between life and death depended on countless small acts: tending a fire carefully, washing hands when convenient, sheltering during storms, or sharing resources with a neighbor.
Each act had consequences, positive or negative, that shaped survival without anyone consciously orchestrating the result. Disaster often forced improvisation, which in turn created inadvertent improvements. After fires, communities rebuilt with sturdier materials. After floods, fields were adjusted and homes relocated. After plagues, social structures shifted subtly, creating better hygiene and isolation practices. None of these measures were perfect or premeditated. They were responses to circumstance, trial and error solutions that accumulated benefits over decades and centuries. The endurance of humanity was also social. Families, clans, and villages supported one another, creating networks that enhanced resilience. The elderly, children, and infirm were sometimes cared for, sometimes abandoned, but in sufficient measure that communities did not vanish entirely. Shared labor, communal knowledge, and social cohesion were not rationally planned systems. They were emergent, arising naturally from the pressures of survival and human inclination. Even the most catastrophic events, plagues, famines, invasions, were met with adaptive responses. Survivors moved, learned, and reorganized. Crop failures prompted diversification. Disease outbreaks encouraged isolation or experimentation with herbal remedies. War necessitated fortifications, relocation, or strategic alliances. Each response was a practical, immediate reaction to a specific threat, yet cumulatively, these actions ensured the survival of populations. Religion and belief systems also contributed indirectly. Faith provided comfort, structure, and moral guidance. Religious institutions coordinated aid, distributed resources, and reinforced social norms. While theology itself could increase risk, such as through dangerous pilgrimages or ritualized gatherings, it also created networks and expectations that maintained cohesion, indirectly enhancing the probability of survival. Humans endured because life demanded it, and the instinct to survive was stronger than despair. Even in the face of repeated failure, communities adapted. Generations observed, experimented, and passed on knowledge, both practical and social, without ever understanding the full scale of their cumulative effect. Each small adjustment, each quiet act of resilience formed a thread in the complex tapestry of medieval survival. The medieval world, therefore, was a world of fragility. Yet, paradoxically, this fragility generated resilience. The unpredictability of environment, disease, and social conditions forced continual adaptation. Humans learned, copied, improvised, and transmitted knowledge. The species persisted because life required action, observation, and adaptation, not because survival was guaranteed or engineered. Even when communities failed, new settlements emerged, often using the lessons learned from vanished predecessors. Soil was managed differently, dwellings constructed with greater care, and water sources monitored more vigilantly. Knowledge spread through observation and imitation. Extinction was avoided not through conscious design, but through the compounding effect of countless small choices that happened to succeed enough of the time to maintain continuity. Ultimately, the medieval world endured by accident, not design. Its survival was neither elegant nor predictable. It was a product of human persistence, incremental adaptation, and fortunate timing. Every act, from planting a seed in a better location to avoiding a river during a flood, contributed to an unplanned web of survival. The accumulation of countless small adjustments, choices, and chance occurrences allowed humanity to persist through centuries of adversity. In this fragile, accident-driven endurance, life was maintained despite constant threat, precariousness, and unpredictability. Humans did not triumph through foresight or control, but through a combination of instinct, observation, incremental improvement, and social cooperation. Survival was haphazard, often precarious, and contingent upon circumstances largely beyond control, but it endured. And so the story of the medieval world concludes not with heroism or deliberate achievement, but with quiet persistence. Humanity survived not because it was planned or engineered, but because it was stubborn, adaptive, and capable of enduring hardship over generations. In the end, the medieval world teaches that life persists through a fragile balance of action, observation, accident, and resilience, and that even in the most uncertain and perilous circumstances, humanity finds a way to endure.